Okay, so properly speaking, the history of the United States starts in the Atlantic states of Western Europe. With the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, there was a general upswing of economic activity and the demand for spices greatly increased. Spain, in an attempt to take some of this trade away from the Ottoman Empire, started exploring new opportunities and ways to get to the East Indies. Christopher Columbus attempted, that's this gentleman up here, attempted to convince the court of Spain to finance an expedition to the East Indies by sailing west. It was his belief that if you sail about 3,000 miles west of Spain, you would hit the East Indies. Unfortunately for him, his math was wrong. If you sail 3,000 miles west of Spain, you do not, in fact, hit India. However, his natural sailor's instinct was correct. There was something out here, and so what he found was the New World. This, incidentally, is why the natives of North and South America are known as Indians, despite the fact that they have absolutely no connection with the subcontinent. So the question is, why were these people coming over to the New World? What were they looking for? Well, they were looking for God, gold, and glory, as the saying went. The God part means that they were coming seeking to try and spread Christianity to the populace of the New World. Gold pretty much speaks for itself, and glory was the desire for fame, for fortune, for power, all the normal reasons why people go and do anything crazy. So this prompted what came to be called the Columbian Exchange. Potatoes, corn, beans, squash, and tomatoes are all native to the New World. Coffee, pigs, horses, oranges, wheat are all native to the Old World. In addition to bringing those wonderful objects, the European settlers brought with them diseases. This was not intentional at first, though later it was used as a weapon, but as a result of these diseases that came, approximately 80% of all the inhabitants of the New World died off. So we're going to skip forward a little bit in time, and we're now a little bit before the American Revolution, and England owns 13 colonies along the eastern shore of what is now the United States. So they can be divided into a couple of different categories. I'll just run through it quickly. In New England, the ones that are in the north, they came primarily seeking freedom of religion, self-government, things like that, which they were not able to get in the Old World. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, were more trade-oriented. They also had less of an English heritage. New York was founded by the Dutch. Delaware was founded by the Swedes. These were later conquered by the English. The southern colonies were more expressly plantation-oriented. This is where the tobacco culture came in. This is where the great cotton plantations were. This is also where the slave culture really took over. Brief side note, we just had an excellent presentation on some of the cultural aspects of the American Indians. A brief word on some of the historical implications. So particularly where we are right now in upstate New York, there was a confederacy called the Iroquois. These were major players throughout the colonial period. They were powers to be reckoned with, however, simply by virtue of the population figures, technological factors, the Amerindians were pushed more and more into the margins. The end result of the course of history was somewhat less than pleasant, as one can imagine. So why are we not all subjects of the British Empire? Why is this a separate country? The reason is that there was some greed, misunderstanding, and other problems between the colonies and the home islands of Britain. So Britain passed a series of navigation acts. The idea was that everything was supposed to go for the benefit of England. So when we had trade, it was for their benefit. If we had manufacturing, it was for their benefit. There were restrictions on it, and it generally caused a great deal of difficulty. In addition, England prohibited the American settlers from spreading west of approximately the Appalachian Mountains. As there was already some population pressure, and certainly there was desire to explore new lands, make more money, this caused a great deal of unhappiness. Skipping forward a little bit more, this and a bunch of other factors which I don't have time to get into eventually led to a revolution. This gentleman over here, for those of you who are not aware, is George Washington. He was the principal American general during the American Revolution. He was also the first president of the United States. He's one of our great national heroes. From a purely military perspective, we should have been squashed almost immediately. This was a tiny country with no real power taking on the greatest superpower of the age. However, by holding off long enough, we were able to convince Britain's traditional enemies, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and a handful of other countries to get involved, and this united effort enabled us to win the war and win our independence. All right. So I don't really have time to go into the Constitution and all that, especially since it will be discussed in a little while. However, I just want to say one of the key things when coming up with a system to run this new country was to draw a balance between strong government and the populace having their rights. So on the question of having the rights, we have the Bill of Rights, where we were the first country to guarantee things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, things like that. We guarantee that. At the same time, we do have a strong central government, because as one of our founding fathers John Adams once said, just a second. An unbridled mob is as dangerous as any tyrant, and this has been the dichotomy that the United States has always sought to ensure that we don't go too far in any direction. Things continued on fine for a while, but there were some issues. There's a strong difference between North and South and certain other parts of this country. This is called sectionalism. So the North was more industrialized, the South was more agricultural. There was considerable unrest and disagreement about what would be the best economic policy for the whole country, and this led to some really nasty tension. At the same time, the South continued and increased the use of slave labor. There's absolutely no excuse for this. It's one of the worst things in American history and probably in any history in the world, though I'm unhappy to say many countries around the world have the same problem. So while this is going on, there's sort of this great expansion of the United States. So we start off with these territories in the east over here. Within a short amount of time, in 1803, we buy the Louisiana territory from France. That's this big, huge chunk right in the middle. In 1845, with the desire of the people of Texas, which had just declared independence from Mexico, we annex Texas. Mexico takes exception to this, and so we fight a war with Mexico. The end result is that we conquer what is now the Southwest. Simultaneously, we have some diplomatic negotiations with England, and we settle the boundary between Canada and the United States, and that gives us Oregon and that bit of territory what's now North Dakota and Minnesota. It's not strictly chronological right now, but since I'm on the subject of expansion, after the Civil War in 1867, we purchased Alaska from Russia. This, by the way, went for 2 cents an acre and probably ranks as one of the 3 or 4 best real estate deals in history. In 1898, we annexed the Republic of Hawaii, and that gives us the 50 states as they are now. Okay, so eventually, between this rapid expansion and this sectionalism and certain other disputes about the nature of slavery, about how the government should run, things like that, we have a civil war between the North and the South. This remains to this day the single bloodiest war in American history, and it was carnage on a truly terrible scale that would not be matched until World War I. Don't really have time to go into it. I suggest people look it up. It's really quite fascinating. After the Civil War, we have one of the greatest economic boom periods in history, the Gilded Age, as it was called. Business goes wild. This is when we start building the railroads on a massive scale. This is when the steel industry really takes off. This is when we really build America. However, while this is going on, there is, of course, still some conflict. This is when the labor movement starts up. This is when some of the reintegration of the southern states, which had lost the Civil War, into the North becomes somewhat messy and would cause issues that would last for a very long time. At about 1850s, we really started getting a massive inflood of immigrants. The United States is built on immigration. I myself am first-generation American. A lot of the people here are immigrants themselves, or children of immigrants, or grandchildren of immigrants. It's part of our culture, it's who we are. One of the things that makes the United States great is that we have everyone from everywhere in this country. And it's one of the foundations of the country. So we're going to flash forward a little bit more, and the United States really starts taking a stage in the international presence, World War I. So we come into the war late, but when we come in as a truly massive force. The war itself is interesting, but the key thing to take away from this is that some of the rhetoric we used during World War I becomes some of the rhetoric that we hear to this day. So we go to war to save democracy. We've heard that a lot. We go to war for freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas isn't as much of an issue as it used to be, that we still hear about from time to time. You could substitute free trade or something like that, and it's the same basic rhetorical idea. At the time, people thought it was the war to end all wars. As you can imagine, they were wrong, but that rhetoric shows up again and again. We always convince ourselves this is the last time, and we're always wrong. So World War I is followed by the Roaring Twenties, which is followed by the Great Depression. The Great Depression remains, even to this day, the worst economic disaster in at least modern recorded history. It was unparalleled. People were starving to death. It was a true mess. It was caused by a number of factors. There was overexpansion, bad weather, poor farming techniques created what's called the Dust Bowl in the Midwest and basically shattered agriculture there. There were a series of tariff wars, things like that. It generally just did not go well. We only really come out of the Great Depression as a result of World War II. So we come into the war a few years later than most of the world in the West. However, when we come in on a scale that has never before been seen in history. By the end of the war, we've mobilized 17 million men for the armed forces. This does not include people who are serving in factories or other non-uniformed people. And by the end of the war, we are the superpower along with the Soviet Union to a lesser extent. We rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan. Europe had been pretty much bombed to the point where it could not be easily recognized. We pay to rebuild that and assist in that. We fight a Cold War with the Soviet Union. We fight a full-scale war in Korea. We begin waging war against hunger and disease. This is one of the great periods of economic expansion in history. It's also a time of a great deal of struggle. It's also a time of tremendous technological change, that sort of thing. But as it's said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So in Vietnam, we go to war with the very best of motives, trying to stop communism, but in the process, we slaughter a great many people who were innocent. And then to add insult to injury in one of the more disgusting displays, many of the soldiers who came home were treated very badly, and especially since today's Veterans Day, you know, we've got to acknowledge this was badly handled. While this is going on during the 60s and 70s, we also have the beginning of the counterculture movement, which has become part of the American psyche to some extent. Flower people, the drug culture, women start for the first time beginning to really be able to enter the workforce and be treated as equals in the business sphere. We still have a lot of work to go there. Witness the ratio of men to women here at school, but you know it's certainly a vast improvement to where it was 100 years ago. Around the same time this is going on, we have the civil rights movement. This gentleman over here, for those of you who are not aware, is the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He is one of the greatest civil rights leaders of history. He was one of the premier orators of our age. Unfortunately, he was assassinated as a result of his actions. However, the improvements that were made were tremendous. People start getting voting rights they're supposed to have had all along. People start getting their Miranda rights. That's when we've all seen on TV, if you're arrested, the officer has to tell you what your rights are, to make sure everybody knows that they have rights and to make sure everyone is protected. And because I'm about to enter current events instead of history, let me just end by saying that the United States put a man on the moon, and I think that's just awesome, and there's really nothing that can top that. So now I will pass it along as we get to politics in America.